Hello, my name is Nadine and welcome to Hop Along Studio. So in today's video, I'm going to be sharing an art journal project about love, since Valentine's Day is just around the corner. I'm going to be using a variety of mediums, including watercolor, to create this page. So let's get started on this week's project. The first thing we need to consider is which paper we're going to be using for this project. I love using Bristol paper because it is smooth and it does take water fairly well. And I'm using a piece of paper for my Bristol journal. Because I do have removable pages in this journal, I'm actually just adhering it to a board that'll prevent it from buckling with the extra water that goes onto it with the watercolor. You can really use any book. It does not necessarily have to be taped off, but this is what I decided to use today just to make my life a little bit easier. In this case, I'm using a Princeton size 6 quill watercolor brush, and I'm going to put a slight wash of water across my paper in a very even way. What this does is this basically will allow me to do a wet on wet technique. And you try not to have too much pooling of the water. You want to have a generally fairly even surface. It's a little harder to do this on a Bristol paper versus a watercolor paper. The watercolor paper absorbs the water a little bit better. And in this case, I am going to start with some rose watercolor. This is one of my newer watercolor colors. And as you can see, just by touching the paper, it'll start bleeding and moving. And usually I'd recommend not trying to get too much paint in your other watercolors. I was being a little bit sloppy this morning as I was working. And the key is to basically just get some good color down. And again, you can just add a little bit more of the paint to get a greater variety in color. And you try not to have it pool too much. I'm also going to add in some red. This is a very bright red, so it will sometimes take over a little bit. So something to consider when you're mixing your colors. This is like a purple lake color. I'm going to mix a little bit of it in with the pink just to add a little bit different variation in color. This is an alizarin crimson hue. It's more of a muted red. I kind of like the purple, but I actually want to go a little bit more with the red and pink tones on this page. I'm doing a very more traditional pink, red, love. Page for this particular project. You can see by adding wet and wet, you can get some really fun patterns as you touch the paper in different ways and add a little bit of different interest to your watercolor background. And if you're ever not sure what to do with your watercolor paper or your paper in your journal when you get started, this is a really great way of just breaking up the background, adding some color, and then deciding from there where you kind of want to go with it. I know some watercolor and journalers basically will just cover all of their pages in watercolor or some sort of ink before they add anything else, just so they don't have to start with a blank page. So now I've actually just have water on my brush, and I'm going to add a few blooms. So basically by tapping your paintbrush, you'll notice that the paint starts moving. And it's not an effect I always use, but I do enjoy adding it. It adds a little bit more texture and color, an interesting texture to this page. I don't add it everywhere, and it works better on the areas that don't have pooling. I have more pooling on this page than I had hoped for, but that's part of the reason when I'm using the quill brush, I have to be a little bit more careful than I do when I'm using other other brushes, because this one does contain a lot of water. And then the last thing I want to do before I let this dry is add salt. I basically just used some coarse salt from my kitchen, put in a little film container just so I have it for crafting uses. And I'm just adding it onto the surface. And I like adding it especially in the places where there's pooling. It seems to absorb the paint a little bit and get some more interesting effects. As you can see, you start seeing the salt and where it's absorbing some of the paint. So again, it adds a really interesting effect to this page. So you're going to want to set this aside and let it dry. It needs to be fully dry. I wouldn't necessarily use a heat gun for this. I would just let it dry naturally and then come back to it when it's ready. As your page is drying, one of the things you can do to prep the next step is by adding some Ranger Archival ink to a stamp of some sort. I'm using a heart stamp in this case. This is from Heartfelt Creations. This is maybe one of their stamp sets from maybe 5+ years ago, so I don't know if they make it anymore, but really any heart stamp or any image that you would like to have as a focal image for this page would do well. I'm actually stamping on vellum today. This is a vellum that's a little bit thicker and a little less transparent, but I wanted to try a different surface than I usually do. And I'm going to stamp a second image just so I have a couple to choose from. I tend to usually stick with heavier papers, so today I wanted something that'd be a little bit transparent that you could actually see the background through a little bit. That would provide a little bit of a different texture than I usually have in some of my projects. So after the watercolor paper has dried, the next thing I want to do is remove the salt off of it. So you can see that wherever I put the salt, it did some more blooming and create these little fun little crystallized bits in here as well. So I'm looking to remove the large amounts of salt from it just by rubbing my finger across the page. Some of them will be a little bit stuck. Some of them make little patterns. Some of them I find that basically anything that is really fine crystal structure here isn't really going to come off, but you want to get rid of the coarse salt. All the big pieces that you don't really want to leave on your piece. But depending on how you do the salt, you can end up with really interesting variations on this. So there was a little bit of blooming, like these soft blooms here happened with my paintbrush, and then these more strong blooms happened because of the salt. So you can see as using salt, you can get some very interesting variation on your project. So now that I've removed the salt, the next thing I'm going to do is start adding some stenciled texture to this background using the Tim Holtz Distress inks. I'm going to be using a few different stencils. This is probably one of my favorite ones, is TCW stencils. I really enjoy their stencils. I like the variety that they have, and I find that they really work well in my projects, and I find lots of multiple uses for them in my work. And I'm going to add some worn lipstick. And there you can see, you can start adding more texture on it. It doesn't necessarily take away from what I've done below, but by adding a little bit of this additional texture, you can end up getting some more variety and variations. You don't want to cover the whole thing, but you do want to do it in places and have some overlapping. And I'm going to actually throw in a little bit of picked raspberry as well to bring in some different tones. And if you want to learn how to use distress inks, I actually do have a video specific on how to use distress inks and do ink blending. So I'm going to leave it there. Again, I like some of these little patches. I like adding a little bit more texture in there. And then what I'm going to do is now go in with a different color. So now I'm going to go with a different color. I like the pink on pink, but I think a little bit of pops of other color would add some variation. So in this case, I'm using the Distress Ink Mermaid Lagoon and through another stencil that I have. This is a very fine stencil, so you're going to get a completely different feel from the more open stencil. And this one has a very, very fine grid, so it's probably meant more for sprays than for inks like this, so it's a little harder to get transfer of color through them, especially in these more tiny, narrow ones. So it's going to be a little bit more work to work it through, because look at how fine those lines are. But I love the look of having that little bit of blue popping through. And so I'm actually rubbing a bit more than gently ink blending the surface, which is usually what I do, but because this is such a close stencil, it requires a little bit more work to get the result that I'm looking for. And then I'm going to actually flip it upside down and do it the other way. And I'm doing this for a bit of a sense of movement. By using the same pattern but maybe varying things about it, like up versus down, it does add a little bit of variation. And I noticed that actually all three of these groups are around the same size, so I'm going to try to go in with just a little bit in places, because it's good to vary the size. Having everything the exact same size, I don't think makes for as interesting a design. And there I had an issue with the corner because I actually did it a little bit over top. So again, I'm going to go in and adjust again. If you make a mistake, you just cover it up by doing something else. So again, not totally what I was planning, but I still like it. Now I love all the blue and the pink that I have going on, and now I would like to add a little bit more stark contrast. So I want to actually use some archival ink and add a stamp to this background. And so for this I'm going to be using this Baroque Stampers Anonymous stamp, which I got a little bit more recently. I wouldn't say it's one of his newest stamps, but I like it. And I really think it adds some real pop to this layout. One of the reasons I really like the Tim Holtz stamps is I love the level of detail in these stamped images. And part of the reason I've not removed the tape from this project is because I have that little white border. I didn't really want to stamp the ink on top of it. So that's part of the reason I've actually kept this on the board for now. And I'm going to have a tiny bit of overlap. And again, I like using parts of the stamp when I do this sort of work. And I think I want a little bit along the top as well. And what I love about this technique is, as you can see with the salt, it hasn't fallen to the background. It still kind of comes up through the ink. And that really makes for a really dynamic mixed media page. Because again, you have the background kind of coming up, you have other colors kind of receding, you have the black that's supposed to be that little bit of pop. It adds a lot of variation and interest to this piece, and it's definitely something that I like to try to do in some of my projects. So the next steps to do is actually take one of your hearts and cut it out. So once you have finished fussy cutting out your image, the next thing you want to do is add a little bit of picked raspberry distress ink to it. One thing I have found with vellum is do not use any water-based project on it. I actually, when I was doing a demo of this earlier just to test out the project, I tried using paint and it curled like crazy. So something to be aware of when you're using vellum. Be careful what you choose to use on it. use a very dry medium. And the ink's about, I think, about as wet as you can really go with this. And because I love the little bits of blue in here, I'm going to add a few spots of blue in this particular heart as well. In this case, I'm just using a Faber-Castell Pitt pen that is blue. And I'm not doing all areas. I'm just going to add a couple little highlights along the swirls. And again, depending on what you have for a stamp or for a stamped image, find a way to maybe add a little bit of an accent to it that is appropriate for the style of stamp. I realize I had a lot of stamps I've had for a lot of years, and I apologize because you can't always get these in stores now, but I also wanted to share with you the concept. Whether you use this stamp or another one, that doesn't mean you can't create or just come up with different imagery for a particular layout. Maybe a challenge to yourself to try something different and find an image that you really like, or even to try to freehand this. You could very easily just cut out a heart and even doodle on it or alter it in some way to give it variation. There's a lot of options out there, so you don't have to feel like you have to stick with exactly the supplies that I'm using. I purposely chose this stamp because I haven't used it in a really long time. And again, like, it's not a lot, but it's just to add a little bit of accent and interest to it and tie it into the background a little bit more. And so now I'm adding kind of the final embellishments on this page. So I liked the heart, but I didn't want the heart to be the only part of this image. So again, I was thinking about the idea of love this week. And with Valentine's Day being around the corner, I really wanted to focus on the word love and what it means to me. So I'm trying to, again, follow kind of the rule of thirds, where this would be one of the rule of thirds line, and then the rule of thirds lines would be coming down around here, which actually puts that heart in a really great spot, and also the words in a good spot. So my prompt for this week definitely was the word love. I do think that love is something that we should always think of, remember, and show to others. And love can be kind of an interesting thing, though. I find that sometimes I feel like I take advantage of the people I love the most, and that's not on purpose. But I think as you spend so much time with the people that you love the most, that sometimes they don't always get the attention they need or the time that they need. Not on purpose, but just out of busyness or other things going on, and they're with you all the time. And I think during this pandemic, it's probably been more of that than normal. We spend so much time with the people that we love that sometimes we don't always realize what a gift they are to us. And it made me also think about, like, how do I like to be loved? And how does that work for me? And how can I love on other people in a similar way? Is there something I can do to just reach out in a way that people feel seen and acknowledged? Because I've realized a few things recently. I realized that listening can be one of the ways you can love people the most. It's also taking that time just to be with them. And during the pandemic, that's really hard. So even reaching out to people, to talk with them, to go out of your way to be with them, even if it means just a call on Zoom or something else. I think all of this is so important, especially during this time. And I don't have an issue with really like the Hallmark holiday-ness of Valentine's Day. But I do feel like I would like it to be something deeper than just getting flowers or going for dinner. That it's made me actually think about, like, how do I want to love on people more and show that love and kindness that I would like shown to me. Okay. So now where I place these letters, it's actually following the rule of thirds pretty well. You have, if you divide this into this way, this love would be right along that line. And if you divide this way as well, you have this kind of in that nice sweet spot in this corner here. I'm actually going to, I like the black letters, but I feel like they could use a little bit more variation on them. So in this case, I'm just using one of these Sakura Jelly Roll pens, and this one I'm just going to put little dots along my word. And that way, it just helps it to pop a little bit. It ties it more to the rest of the colors in this page. So by adding that just little touch there, that really adds a little bit to this page. And the last thing I'm going to do is actually use one of these Pentel Crazy Pop pens. What's nice about this one is actually blue and has little bits of gold in it. And I'm actually going to be adding my journaling, just following some of the cursive lines in this. And then I'll consider this a finished page. So now that I finished my journaling, again, I was just following all of the cursive bits here and was writing down some of the things that mean something to me about love. So I'm actually going to remove the tape as well, just to show you what the finished product looks like. I was thinking about some of the things that make me feel loved, like being shown affection, by being listened to, and thinking about how if I enjoy those things, are there things in the people's lives around me that they enjoy that they would be blessed by if I was able to show them love in a way that they really felt loved. And so this is maybe my challenge for this page, is to think about some of these things and maybe try to have them in my own life in a way that I can try to show love to others in a way that makes them feel seen and cherished. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, if you could like it, subscribe to my channel, and maybe provide a comment below about what you liked about this video. As well, I have my website, hopalongstudio.com, where I have other ideas on how you can have a self-care habit in your own life. I hope you have a really great week, and I will see you next time.